Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, devolving power. In this pandemic, we have tended to look to national governments to act, expecting them to pull every lever available to protect life. But have we been looking in the wrong place? Our local, state and regional authorities, often with more knowledge of which policies are appropriate and workable in a given area, better placed to take the lead in health emergencies. And as electorates around the world decry out-of-touch elites, has the time come for a wave of radical political devolution?
I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent.
And I'm Lizzy Burden, economics reporter at the Telegraph. We'll be your guides, and if you like what we're doing, please hit the subscribe button as it helps people find us. Joining us this week is Raghuram Rajan, former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Welcome to CoronaNomics.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, I want to ask you, why is political devolution such a good idea in your view?
Well, I think you look at the countries that have done reasonably well. Of course, it's too early to tell all the elements that went into success, but you look at Germany, you look at South Korea. These are countries that effectively have set some broad parameters at the center, also looked at generating and allocating resources, but left the details of dealing with the virus to their provinces, to their regions, decentralized it simply because different regions, different areas are dealing with different facets of the same problem. Sometimes they're at different stages, sometimes they have different resources, different medical facilities, sometimes they have a different population of different age. So what decentralization does is it allows the local to address the problem while of course being helped by the central government. But I do want to point out the difficulties of having the decision taken at the center when the center doesn't know what is happening in much of the country and can't attune central policy to the specifics of particular areas. Take, for example, the Indian decision to essentially close down. The country was given 4 hours notice, but Delhi and Mumbai were, at the center of the infection at that time, but some areas in the Northeast didn't have much infection at all. Of course, once the national lockdown was announced, you soon found that some areas which didn't have very many infections were actually suffering economically. And so the entire national lockdown had to be withdrawn, perhaps a little too early for some places.
Raghu, I want to ask you, you've written about decentralization and devolution of power as a way of sort of dealing with the pressures which have helped result in populism. Let's look at a chart showing the rise of populist parties in Europe. For many years, there was around 10%, and then a clear, steady rise in more recent decades, up to about 20% in 2018. So it's clearly a trend, but why is it happening? You identify demagogues and populist politicians and their protectionist policies as dangers to our prosperity. And you've written that voters have directed their anger at distant authorities and embraced populists who are closer to home. But if we had devolution, let me ask you, isn't it possible we could simply end up with local populists and perhaps even fewer checks and balances than we have at the moment? And even if these leaders are not populist, couldn't they just be just as incompetent as national leaders?
Absolutely. So I have pushed for devolution, not necessarily because we'll get a whole range of leaders who are much better than the alternatives, but really because I think democracy, when starved of local power, local ability to influence, gives people a sense of powerlessness. Yes, I can vote, but the person I vote for is far away and doesn't really care about me. Local democracy gives people a greater sense of agency. And that prevents them from looking for alternatives which may be much more unpalatable. It could well be more effective First, because the local authorities have a far better sense of what the local problems are, and those differ from place to place. Local challenges, local capabilities, even local funding differs from place to place. Equally important, with modern technology, we have a better way of keeping local authorities in check. There are apps which allow you to figure out what they're doing, to opine on what they're doing, maybe to get a small demonstration together if you don't like what they're doing. So there is much more democracy at work locally than used to be in the past. Undoubtedly, local government was always accused of greater levels of corruption and was always thought of as less capable than national government. And in a sense, it could be true, because in the nation, you have far more people to choose from when you're choosing the leader relative to the local. But that said, the combination of local surveillance coupled with local information often tends to create more local responsiveness, which ultimately is what democracy is about.
Yeah. How would you answer the sort of counter argument that it's somewhat idealistic to expect local governments to be more in tune with local populations, and also how does emerging markets fit in with this? I mean, the quality of local of leadership, you've said, is been in the shortest supply of all commodities in this crisis. How do they fit into what you're prescribing?
There's always idealism in hoping for better leadership, right? But is it more idealistic to hope that there are maybe 600 good leaders out of 1,000 in local areas, versus hoping that one leader that you choose in the country is a good one? My sense is, there's law of large numbers works a little better. So you can make mistakes in either case. And the truth is, the easier it is to get rid or to control a mistake, the better it is. And will it work well in all cases? Not necessarily. And we all know of examples of local mafias getting entrenched, and every country has its own stories. But it's also possible to have stories, which I think there are many, of successful local governments which have made a serious change. In many Indian cities, one of the problems is the mayor in the city is largely disempowered. And because they're disempowered, the public services in the city tend to be neglected. Now, if they had their own local government, which was empowered to take local decisions, you may have far better cities. That's a debate which is ongoing, for example, in India.
The role of US state governors in places such as Florida, which we can see here, has been controversial during the pandemic. Some have been accused of locking down overzealously, and others have been accused of not locking down quickly or strictly enough. These are often partisan battles over issues like mandatory mask wearing, just as they're partisan issues on a national level. Isn't there a danger in assuming that decisions taken lower down the political chain are automatically better, or enjoy more local consent?
I want to emphasize there are a number of states which seem to have dealt with the dysfunctionality of the federal government and attempted to contain the virus on their own. New York State, for example, after some horrendous sort of events, have seemed to have brought the virus under control. The decentralized nature of the US response has been a mitigant to the fact that the federal actions have largely been less than laudatory on the coronavirus pandemic. You don't want to focus just on how states have combated the pandemic, but also state as well as regional as well as local responses to the adverse consequences of the pandemic, on livelihoods, how neighborhoods have come together to help the people who have been hurt, how local efforts to create employment, to create welfare services, to create food banks have, in time-honored US fashion, come together. And I think you can see this in country after country. These local efforts are supported by local government and are, I think, an important factor in the fight against the pandemic.
You mention, Raghu, these divisions in society, and you've talked about one of the drivers of this being economic failure, about places and communities being left behind. But as you will know, some analysts say that populism is driven not so much by economic insecurity, but a lot of the people who voted for Donald Trump and who voted for Brexit here in the UK were pretty comfortably off. What do you say to that counter argument about the drivers of populism, and how does it affect the argument you're making about decentralisation?
Right. Well, it depends on which paper you read, right? You read a paper by an economist, it's all economic factors driving it, which are correlated with social factors. You read a paper by a sociologist or a political scientist, it's the social factors, not the economic factors. And my sense is, in reality, it's both. Now, how does this account for better, well-off people voting Republican? They've always voted Republican. So for them, Trump was just another Republican. So in that sense, I don't think there's a big difference. There is, however, a class of people who are reasonably well-off, but look around them and see people in their community, in their who they identify with, doing not so well. And you could argue that these are some of the switcher-overs who may have been a little more pragmatic earlier on and now are voting with their identities or with their beliefs. But all said and done, I mean, the reality is with the pandemic, every fault line we've had before has become highlighted. And the fault line in which many people have livelihoods which are not as good, which are more precarious, which are leaving them behind. Whether these are the historically disadvantaged minorities, of which the United States, as we well know, has many, but also the newly disadvantaged, the people living in rural areas with one big employer in town where the big factory just closed. I mean, both deserve a helping hand in this kind of environment, and how to get that, to my mind, will be the focus of post-pandemic politics. How do we ensure that that people have the capacity to earn decent livelihoods? How do we ensure that they're safe livelihoods? How do we ensure that if in fact there are calamities like the one we've seen, there is a safety net under them which is reasonable?
I want to talk a little bit about the potential limits of a devolutionary approach. You write that while national climate policies cannot be determined separately in every community, they can at least reflect a bottom-up consensus. This is related to what we've been talking about in a way, but since the science of global warming has unfortunately become a front in the culture war in the US, how would that consensus be reached any more easily through devolution?
Well, driving such important policies from the center without selling it, so to speak, more widely has enormous consequences. You saw in France, for example, with the Gilets jaunes rebellion. These were people who basically said, you've determined all these policies on climate change somewhere else, and then you come out and levy a huge tax on gasoline. But we're the guys who drive 80 miles a day to get to work because there's no work near where we live. And we're paying the price. So, you're worried about the end of the world. We're worried about reaching the end of the month with our incomes. So, when you don't sell these grand policies, they have no bite. And then you get the pushback. Where did you decide this? In some room in Paris? Unless you get people to buy in, which means selling the policy. And, if your leaders don't accept it, change your leader. But get people who can then make the case. We need both devolution, but also true democracy in the sense that take people with you.
There has been a tension here in the UK, at least, between devolution and equality to some extent. We often hear objections to a postcode lottery where people in different areas get different levels of service. People say they want local control, but also effectively they often demand centralisation to deliver a sort of homogenous, standardised service right across the country. How do you address those sort of tensions and competing demands from the same public?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I have in mind not a disadvantaged localism, but actually an inclusive localism. For example, I've been an international economist, done some work on aid. What strikes you with aid is the one case where it is used well, one case where countries grow, is when they determine how they grow. They determine their own development. When it is forced from the outside, thou shalt do this and that and something else, and the center drives the spending of resources, the center drives the development agenda, you don't get development because there is no local buy-in. So similarly to international aid, I would suggest that there be support, but that support in a sense, be untied to specifics and be more open to the locals deciding whether they want a community college or they want better equipment in schools or they want childcare. But don't determine everything from the center, because then that kills local initiative, again, exacerbates the democratic deficit. So make it something where people tend to have the space to experiment, but also if they make mistakes, it's their mistakes. And therefore, they have to take responsibility for that. I think that's the learning process that communities go through, and we should encourage that.
We've talked about building back better after the crisis, and we've got a live debate here in the UK about whether the Bank of England's mandate should be changed from targeting inflation to targeting nominal GDP. The former UK Treasury Minister, Lord Jim O'Neill, was on this programme promoting the idea, and when that was reported in the Telegraph and the Independent, the former UK Chancellor, Sajid Javid, backed the idea as well. I wonder, as a former central banker, what your view is on this?
For the layperson, it doesn't matter much whether you're targeting inflation or targeting nominal GDP. Most people, certainly in my experience, don't quite understand what nominal GDP means. The reality is these are different ways of trying to get inflation up after inflation has been really low for a long time. The old problem of central bankers was, how do you keep inflation down? That was a problem in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. Unfortunately, central banks, for whatever reason, seem to have succeeded in keeping inflation down. And now their problem is it's too low. How do we get it up? Especially in a world with enormous debts contracted during the pandemic, a little bit of inflation helps in making the medicine go down, so to speak. For nominal GDP targeting to work, the public has to understand what that means and then have expectations about inflation, which in fact will make it easier for the central bank to elevate inflation. That's a stretch. And to my mind, we have to see if it works. There is a danger of changing targets every so often. For a few years it's inflation targeting, then it's nominal GDP, then it's average inflation, then it's something else. There is a risk that whatever credibility the central bank has goes. My own preference is, let's try and figure out what else we can do to elevate growth rather than relying on monetary policy magic to achieve it.
So in your view, it's just too risky in the middle of a crisis to be tampering with the targets?
I think there are far more important things we can spend our time on. I would argue that the bigger issue that industrial countries have is how they create livelihoods for people, sustainable livelihoods. And that to me is not monetary policy. It's really about the nuts and bolts of government. And, for far too long, we have pushed the issue of growth onto central banks and said, they're going to figure out some trick to get it done. And we've realized they have no tricks in the box. We really have to get back to how do we ensure people have the capabilities to generate sustainable growth. And that means going back to, do they have the education? Do they have the opportunities? Do they have the help from the government in terms of searching for jobs and so on? These are all things that I don't think central banks have a role in.
In 2005, you famously outlined the vulnerabilities of the financial system when pretty much everyone else in the world thought it was solid. And then a few years later, we had the great financial crash and you were vindicated. Today, everyone's assuming again that the financial system's safe. So I wonder if you're concerned at all that there's another blind spot this time.
Oh, I am concerned simply because even if we find a vaccine, and everybody seems to be gung-ho about that possibility, and even if it works as advertised, and even if we roll it out by the beginning of next year or by the first quarter of next year, there's plenty of damage done. Now, industrial countries have managed to help households, help firms withstand some of that damage. There still is significant damage. But go to the emerging markets, the amount of damage that's been done and is continuing to be done in those economies is significant. And so I would think this time around, the center of the damage will be in the developing countries and emerging markets, especially the ones that have yet to control the virus. And that, if there's a financial sector spillover, that could well be both in emerging markets and industrial countries if this continues for a long time, that financial sector spillover will start first in those countries that haven't been able to support their corporate sectors.
A lot of people have been very worried about the Chinese financial sector for some time. Is that one of the emerging market countries where you think this might happen from?
It could have been, except the Chinese have done a wonderful job, at least from what it seems, to control the virus, and they've brought production back. However, to bring production back when the world is essentially closed down, they've resorted to an older tactic of theirs, which is expand credit and let infrastructure spending and real estate spending move up, something they've resisted for some time because they found in the longer run this creates bad debts. Now, the Chinese are still dealing with the enormous leverage they have in their system and the enormous amount of bad debts of the past. We're going to get a few more. But at least they have, in a sense, brought their economy out with limited damage from the lockdowns, because they had a very severe lockdown and ensured that the pandemic was controlled. For countries that haven't dealt with it yet, I mean, they're going to be in this living, half dead stage where they're not into full motion because there's still the pandemic. At the same time, they can't lock down because people have already been through a lockdown and are not willing to support much more of that kind. And so it's going to be very difficult for those countries. And since they have limited resources, they can't bail out their corporations. They can't help households beyond a certain point. And so the damage that's done. So kid, essentially is taken out of school because schools have closed, and plus, the household is in a bad way. That kid doesn't go back to school. That kid is permanently out of school. That's the kind of damage that's being done in emerging markets. Livelihoods forever being changed by this kind of crisis. So I do think that the damage there, which we're not talking that much about, is going to be significantly greater than in industrial countries.
Yeah, and in the sort of the spillover knock-on effects, I mean, a lot of regulators in the West are saying our banking systems are well capitalized. It sounds like what you're saying is don't be complacent, don't assume that you won't be hit by these spillovers.
I think there is great uncertainty about the duration of the adverse economic effects, right? So we really don't know anything about when. Is there going to be a second wave? Is the virus going to be contained after the first wave, even if there isn't a full-blown second wave? What about the vaccine? When are people going to feel confident enough to travel, to go into planes? I mean, all this, the enormous amounts of uncertainty surrounding this. So the decision by some countries to stop banks paying dividends makes sense. That, in this environment where we really don't know what is going to happen, better opt for safety than be sorry down the line. I mean, certainly it's a precautionary move, and I think it's important to conserve capital since we simply don't know what's going to happen.
Well, it's been an extremely stimulating conversation, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about the decentralisation, devolution policy proposal in the months and years ahead. But thank you so much to our guest, Raghu Rajan, for appearing on CoronaNomics.
We'll be talking to many more top thinkers in the weeks ahead to discuss how to weather the economic storm of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And remember, if you like what we're doing, please hit like and share.
And if you'd like to talk to us, just leave us a comment below.
This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films.